am Carlo Bustos, Educational Programs Leader at Proformative, the online community for corporate finance, accounting, treasury, and related professionals. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Effectively Manage Risks with SAP Risk Management Using a Rapid Deployment Solution. You can preserve and strengthen your core business by aligning the strategy and objectives of the organization with your risk management principles. Improve focus and decision-making through informed and directed application of best practice enterprise risk management principles, and learn how quickly you can improve your enterprise risk management results with SAP Rapid Deployment Risk Management Solution. I would like to thank SAP for helping us make this event possible and their generous support, for which helps us to deliver this webinar at no cost, just like everything, at Proformative. And now a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, I would like to welcome you back to Proformative. If this is your first time at Proformative, I just would like to give you a brief overview on who Proformative is. We are the largest growing online community of finance, treasury, accounting, and related professionals. We are the ad-free, noise-free community where we encourage and expect peer-to-peer collaboration. Check it out at proformative.com. And just a few event notes today. Just wanted to make sure everyone is aware that the links to today's presentation, along with the recording, will be emailed to you post the webinar within 24 hours. The presentation and the items being reviewed today will be available online and are currently available for you to download via proformative.com/resources. This is a no CPE webinar, and we wanted to make sure everyone is aware of that. But we do encourage asking questions, so please feel free to use your questions box within your GoToWebinar panel. We will take questions throughout the demonstration today. I know our two speakers are subject matters within this particular arena and would love to answer as many questions as possible. For the questions that we do not get a chance to answer, we will work with the speakers to make sure we do post the webinar. And lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar. We do ask for your feedback as it makes us get better at what we do and deliver to you as a community, and so we thoroughly appreciate your time at the end. Okay, let's get started. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We are joined today by Philip Tillman. Philip is the Managing Director of CQS GRC Solutions, a South African-based company that specializes in the implementation of SAP's GRC software solutions. He has also served on the Executive Committee of the Institute of Risk Management and published research on the topic of enterprise risk management as part of completing an MBA. Philip has been involved with the governance software since 2007 and has been involved in over 100 implementations of enterprise risk management software across telecommunication, resources, financial, and diversified industries. We are also joined by Troy Konis. Troy is the U.S. Managing Director of Turnkey Consulting, a global consulting company that specializes in SAP security and control solutions. Troy's experience encompasses over 18 years of technical, hands-on SAP implementation work with over 23 cumulative years of work in the information systems consulting. His specialization lies in the SAP security and controls and has helped many Fortune 500 companies with large-scale SAP security and control implementation. So with that, I'm going to hand over full control to Philip here, and both Philip and Troy will walk us through. Take it away, Troy.
Thanks, Carlo. So Turnkey Consulting is a global consulting company. We specialize in SAP security and controls implementation and consulting solutions. We have a very experienced team within the U.S. made up primarily of ex-Big Four global risk management services consultants. We have performed an extensive number of GRC consulting engagements, including GRC version 10 installation and upgrades. I'd like to now turn the presentation over to Philip. Philip is a risk management expert out of South Africa, and he'll walk us through some of SAP's risk management functionality and provide an overview of our rapid deployment solution.
Smashing, Troy. Thank you very much. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Philip Tillman. I've got the great pleasure of talking to you today about a rapid deployment solution in the space of enterprise risk management. What this session is about is the automation of your existing risk management process, which, let's face it, is normally sitting in Excel, into a working live SAP solution in under a month. This is something that has been done a number of times, so it's an implementation which is live on a number of large organizations, ranging from financial institutions to oil and gas companies, and we've been able to go live within that time period based on a set of IP that has been built with a standard number of predefined principles within the risk management software. I'm going to talk a little bit about what those principles would be. Now, in terms of the presentation today, I'm going to use the agenda slides in PowerPoint, but I'm going to jump into the application itself, and I'm going to run through that. I'm going to use the application to be able to talk about that. So you'll see me dragging the screens from SAP on and off. So the first thing I would like to be able to talk about in terms of the functionality of a rapid deployment solution is the ability from a risk management perspective to identify risks. Now, SAP provides us a number of facilities to do this, one of which is a risk universe. So it gives us the opportunity to standardize our terminology for risk. I'm going to show you in a moment an example of why that's such a powerful thing to do. But a risk terminology allows us, or risk taxonomy allows us to predefine a standard set of data in terms of risk categories and risk templates, so that everyone in the organization knows that a risk of fire means a risk of fire. It doesn't mean a combustion risk or potential risk of an explosion. It means a risk of fire. And everybody calls it the same thing throughout the organization, which with extremely large organizations becomes quite critical. So what SAP gives us the ability to do is to define this in advance. Now, one of the things that's very important, and I need to clarify that in a rapid deployment solution, the only thing that doesn't come with is the risk content, which is to say the only people who know what risks are relevant in your organization is going to be the management of that organization. So we can't predefine the risks facing the organization. So the software and the RDS is very much about the functionality. And what I've done here is I've actually gone into a risk template. Now, the purpose of a risk template is that by its name, template, is it's sitting in a risk library and isn't actually a risk yet because it's not sitting out in the organization. It's almost like a library book, which in this case is called a theft of property, and it gives us the ability to define a number of potential impacts that face the organization. So in this case, we have an impact, a financial impact, a potential operational impact, and a stakeholder relation impact facing any of the divisions or the business units within which this risk exists. Now, what that gives us the ability to do when we go into the assessment stage of the risk is to understand not just the potential impact of a risk, but how that risk impacts the organization financially, operationally, or from a stakeholder relation perspective. So it's nice to be able to predefine and centrally say, we as a group risk management or central risk team can tell you what you must be thinking of as a minimum standard. It's not to say that people out there in their own world won't be able to add their own potential impacts to this, they will. But it's saying that from a group perspective, it's taking quite a centralized approach to do that. So it gives us the ability to define a standard set of risks, and then there's a tab next to that called Risk Instances, which allows us to be able to see, well, where does this risk currently exist in our organization? Now, at the moment on the right-hand side, you can see it exists in six of the divisions. And we're actually going to go into one of those risks itself, and we're going to show you how we further evaluate a risk and how we go and assess a risk, how we link that risk back to the organization structure or the objectives and strategies of the organization as well. Now, the purpose or the main goal in order, the purpose of doing risk management in terms of standardized risk terminology is to be able to look at the end of it at a report and say, where does this one risk expose our organization? As an example, there might be a very small risk in a single division, but if that risk exists in 20 of our divisions or business units, it's going to be a very large risk to the organization holistically. So what you're looking at here is a risk report we did for a customer, and I will qualify that any of the data you see in any of the reports here is dummy data. Dummy data both in terms of the names of the risks as well as the actual ratings. So there's nothing, don't go and buy shares in any of the companies that you see here in terms of information. So the great thing about a report like this is it's actually the consolidation of a huge amount of information, and across the top it's saying, here's all of our divisions, things like our coal operations, our group finance, our services division. On the left-hand side, here's all of our risks, and it's actually showing what is our risk rating throughout this entire organization. And so, for example, if I take the second line down, a cost of electricity, I can see that this is a red risk in our commodities and our service management division. I can see on the right-hand side it's 0 in our training division, and that's because nobody's assessed it. But in something like corporate human resources, it's down low at a 6. So the ability to now take a complete enterprise-wide view of how a single risk, which is standardized in terms of terminology in the organization, requires a centralized tool. Now, there are other centralized tools out there. Clearly, for SAP customers, it makes a lot of sense to use SAP, but this is the one thing that Excel simply can't do. It cannot consolidate all of these risks from different risk registers onto a single report and give you this kind of view unless you're something close to a VBA expert. So the ability to get intelligible data out of the solution is clearly, in my mind, the majority of what people are trying to achieve in terms of risk management. So I'm actually going to start by going through some of the reports. So start with the end in mind is one of the great 7 habits. So let's have a look at some of the reporting that comes as standard within the rapid deployment solution. At the end of this presentation, I will be talking about the rapid deployment solution and what's in it holistically, but I'm going to go through the output first of all. And when we talk about reporting from a risk management perspective, that's going to be on several different levels. So on the first level are operational reports. So on the management level, we have risk registers. So an operation can easily, at a single click, print out its risk information and what the action plans or the mitigation plans are in that division. Of course, that could roll up to running a risk register at the board level and having a look at all risks, but inevitably there'll be too many risks to run that at a board level. So by the time we get up to something like a risk committee level, which is normally a subcommittee of a board, that's when you're going to have a look at summary reports and you're going to have a look at heat maps. So you might have a look at the top 20 risks facing the organization in detail, which is a different report than you might look at the operational level. And you might have a look at heat maps and decide, how many risks are we facing, how many of them are high, medium, and low. And typically, by the time we get up to the board level, is when we're going to start doing what's called risk aggregation. And SAP is uniquely qualified, in my experience, to perform risk aggregation quantitatively. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it does that a little bit later, but fundamentally, you can still assess a risk qualitatively or subjectively using a simple 5x5 scale, and SAP converts that into quantitative data based on profitability or turnover data of the organization. So it really provides some very valuable information to a board. So I'm going to run through some reports and give some examples of how that might be. So importantly, all of these reports are standard in the solution. So the first report I'm going to give an example at on an operational level would be a risk register. And in a risk register, it's going to have a standard number of columns across the top. If you're doing risk management at the moment and you have an Excel spreadsheet, you'll recognize that this is effectively a nice looking version of that Excel spreadsheet with almost all of the columns that are involved in the risk process. So the first column, it's going to give us our risk name. The second column is going to start giving us our inherent probability and impact. It's going to give us our inherent risk rating, which in this case is a high, which is a 12. It then talks about the impact categories. So in this case, there was a financial, reputational, and operational impact category to this. So it's not just a financial risk. It then looks at our residual probabilities, impacts, and again, residual rating. And then on the right-hand side, this is all about how are we responding to risks. A very important point is the terminology that SAP uses, which it refers to responding to a risk and having management responses. So that risk would have a response. That response would have a specific due date. In this case, the first response is called aggressive recruitment policy. The response owner is Kate Williams, and it's a corrective response type. And there's some actions that need to be put in place. And of course, there can be multiple responses to each item. So this particular view is very detailed, and essentially on a line-by-line basis, it allows us to look at our risk and our responses. If we wanted to roll that up slightly, the next level is to start looking, saying, well, I don't just want to see my risk information on a single line. I might want to graphically represent that. Ordinarily, people are saying, what is my risk before my controls or before my responses are in place, and what are my risk levels after my responses are in place? Now, this assumes an organization is using both inherent and residual risk. There might be people on the call who use the ISO 31000 methodology and they only have residual risk, and which the RDS does also cater for. But in the context of this call, I'm using a COSO methodology, which uses the concept of both inherent and residual risk. And when that's the case, and there's a very large difference between a residual and an inherent risk score, such as the second last risk from the right, the fuel price, clearly that's where there's a significant weighting of control, and that's where monitoring and control functions and auditing would place a huge reliance on this information. So again, this report is standard within the rapid deployment solution. So another example of a great report, which would probably roll up to something like our risk committee levels, is to say, well, let's have a look on a heat map and say, in this particular case, we're using a 5x5 matrix, which SAP refers to as impact and probability. Some organizations might call it a consequence and a likelihood. And you can see this report is counting the number of risks that are sitting in each of the quadrants. So in this case, if I look at the residual risk heat map on the right-hand side, on the top right, I can see that there are 2 risks. And I can see on the left-hand side that on the inherent risk map, there are actually 4 risks sitting in that top right quadrant. So it's being reduced. In the table underneath, we actually have some more detail talking about, on an inherent risk basis, how many risks are low, medium, high, and very high, both inherently and residually. So giving us some great summary data sitting here. And behind this report, all of the other pages would actually give us the detail of those risks in a register format.
Hey, Philip, it's Carlo, but before you move on, and apologies for interrupting here, I just had a question around the reports themselves. Is it possible, so I mean, obviously these are pretty standard and from your perspective going to be best practices, but some companies will obviously have their own reporting criteria or templates that they've incorporated in the board along with their executive suite is accustomed to viewing. Is that part of the program you guys also offer in kind of changing it towards their templated reports that they currently have?
It's absolutely part of the software. Clearly, as part of a rapid deployment solution, we have predefined a suite of reports. And I'm just flicking to a slide now which is going to show you a number of different customer reports to show you that there's 2 things that are available in a report, one of which is the look and feel. So in this screen, you can see there are 5 different reports, each from a different customer. You can see that the logos have varied, the color scheme has varied, fitting entirely in line with that organization's corporate identity and look and feel. You can also see from all these reports that the structure of the report is completely different. So on a technical basis, that's actually what it is a crystal report sitting on top of the standard ALVs or the standard reporting that's in GRC. And this crystal reporting tool is part of the GRC solution. So there is absolutely no additional cost from a licensing perspective. There is report design, and I tend to find that most customers want a variation on a theme rather than a completely new report. But as you can see in the top right, there's an example of a dashboard report where there are a number of different graphs or details sitting in one tool. So the only limitation is, well, the only 2 limitations are your imagination and your assuming the data is available and in the system to be able to do it. So there's a lot of flexibility around that, and again, that can be built on top of the RDS as well. So hopefully that answers the question in terms of reporting. But because reporting was such a huge part of a enterprise risk management requirement, the key to a very quick implementation for an RDS is standardized reporting. And we've tried to build we've tried to build a large number. So I'm actually showing you a very small number. We've got about 25 standard reports, but it just gives you a nice look and feel to say pretty much any major report type we've covered, but inevitably somebody's going to want something unique, especially if they're used to seeing it, and that's key. So a great example, yeah.
No, thanks for that, Philip. And I just want to take this time to let the audience members know to utilize the questions box within their GoToWebinar panel to ask questions at any time here. We will have a Q&A session towards the end, but if you do see something or have any questions, we'll be more than happy to answer them throughout the session.
Okay, awesome. So this is a great example of a report that comes out, and one of the challenges with risk management systems that aren't in a software tool is that how do you track the actions that come out? You go into a workshop, you decide what the risks are, you're going to rate them and have very heated discussions which break out, and inevitably out of that you'll agree a set of actions. A report like this allows you to say, in a division called Enterprises, we have an individual called Grant Jones. He or she has a number of tasks that have been assigned to them or due dates. We can see how many of those tasks are complete, how many are overdue, and we can look against each risk, how many responses there are, who's responsible, when they're due, are they complete, are they overdue, or incomplete, as some in this particular case you can see. So a very critical part of that. Now, when we get up to the risk committee level is when organizations start to say, well, hold on, we want more than just a single line item. This is a huge risk for us. It's almost going to sink us. We want a lot of data. And so you might have a look at what we call a risk per page report, where in a single page you can see everything about that risk. So on the right-hand side, you've got a heat map plotting the inherent and the residual ratings of that risk. On the left, you've got all the detail of the inherent and the residual impact and probability and risk rating levels. It's also converting it to the value at risk in terms of quantitative data, and I'm going to show you a little bit how it does that. Underneath that, it talks about the impacts, the drivers, and for your benefit, drivers is not a guy who goes and gets something for you. A driver is what SAP have referred to as a cause. And underneath that, we then have the responses, very detailed action steps, when it's due, and so on. So it can be a very high-level report like a heat map, or it can go into infinite detail for specific risks that a risk committee are going to want to look at as well. And as I flick to the next report, the next screen, which we touched on earlier, any of the look and feel will be able to fit into the corporate identity, and the ability to adjust this look and feel is part of the RDS. So the reporting and the formats are absolutely standard. We can create new ones, but as part of the RDS, they're standard. But as part of the RDS, we always change the look and feel with the customer's logos and their own couple of primary colors as well.
Philip, sorry, we have a question from the audience. It's kind of a two-part question, so I'll give you the first part. Does this cover both kind of the operational and kind of managerial as well as capital risks for a company, or is it more towards the capital base?
So the risks themselves can be of any nature. So the very nature of enterprise risk management is independent of both industry and risk type. So part of the first step of risk management is always going to be the classification of a risk. And in the classification of a risk, you're then going to decide what type of risk this is. And so you're in a position where you can then define that. And that really falls in line with your risk categories that I started with earlier. So you'll define your risk categories in a way that you can get the data out. So normally if you'll say, is it a capital, an operational risk, is it a business risk, is the way that you've structured your risk universe at the beginning so that that becomes a filter for your reporting at the end. So if you guys are looking at the screen in front of you, and I know there's a second part to this question, you're now looking at a risk screen, and my cursor is now on a section that refers to the risk category. So this particular risk forms as part of a security risk. That could have been a capital risk, a business risk, an environmental risk, or however you've structured that information. And I think the important thing is that the risks are treated the same way, which is to say that they're analyzed using the same methodology and in terms of the same rating scales, and I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. What was the second part of that question?
Yeah, and then the second part of the question is there a way from the reporting and kind of the dashboarding for upper management, obviously that's what they're going to be really looking for, is to identify the impacts of the types of risks. So some impacts are, obviously, as you guys have pointed out, are tangible versus intangible, but does the reporting allow for upper management to kind of see that very clearly up front?
It does, and it depends on how you want to slice the data. So, in fact, just after this screen, I'm going to go into the analysis screen. And the key thing about the analysis is that you're actually assessing or analyzing each impact differently. So that you might want to say, look, we have a financial risk and we want to quantify that. We want it down to a dollars and cents figure. You might say that an environmental risk, how on earth do we qualify how do we quantify an environmental risk or a health and safety risk? So you have the ability to treat different impacts in different ways, and then, of course, sort that in terms of filter and slice and dice and reporting on the way out. So I'll run through this first screen, and then I'll get into the analysis part and hopefully show more detail on that.
Fantastic. And then, Philip, while you are on the analysis part, I mean, can you touch on a little bit of who do you think or who do you and Troy see as kind of the oversight aspect? Would it be internal audit, the chief compliance or risk officer, or is this something that, you know, the finance function ultimately has ownership of and oversight?
Okay, so that's a very relevant and risk mature question. So one of the reasons you're getting this presentation from a company based in South Africa is for the last 3 years on the Global Competitiveness Index, South Africa has rated #1 for a few things that we're not proud of, but the one thing we are proud of is our corporate governance and our board efficiency. And one of the reasons is we have an incredibly strong auditing practice locally. So the oversight and the monitoring function should be mainly an audit function. Now, if organizations are doing risk-based audits, which is increasingly the case, this risk register should be informing audit in terms of their audit plans. And theoretically, the higher the difference between the inherent risk and the residual risk, the more reliant you are on controls, and they're the first thing that you're actually going to go and target at. So at the moment, the risk management module itself doesn't allow you to go and perform the auditing. That's done in a separate module of SAP. What it does allow you to do is to identify and manage the risks themselves. And some of the ways you're going to evaluate the risk on this screen are what's important. So we can see that this risk is a risk called a theft of property, which is sitting in the division called Systems, Operations, and Planning. Now, very importantly, is organizations, or ISO 31000, which is the new global standard for risk management, defines a risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So SAP have a field here which allows you to link your risks to the strategic objectives which are relevant to this division. Clearly, there's no point listing all the objectives of a group. It's only the ones that are relevant to this division. These objectives are listed here. So one of the ways you're going to filter your data on the way out is the board are going to say, look, we have 5 big objectives that are key to our growth this year. I want to know the biggest risks that are facing us in terms of that objective, and in which divisions, and what are we doing about them. And the way we're analyzing this risk here gives us the ability to do that. And then lending itself to the second part of that question, at the bottom of this screen, it gives us the ability to go and add impacts. So you can see at the bottom there are 3 impacts, a financial, an operation, and a stakeholder relation impact, and they're both individually described. And if I go and I click on the Add button, I can actually go and add any number of impacts. And this is in line with an organization's own risk management impact structure, but as part of the risk management RDS, we have predefined this based on our experience of best practice, but this list of impact categories can fit in line with yours. It's a very simple table sitting in the back of SAP that we adjust. So this particular data in terms of the input is not fixed, but we have built some best practice into this as well. So we could add a 4th, a 5th, or 6th impact category there. So on the first step, we're actually evaluating our risk. The next step is to go and actually perform an analysis. And in the screen that I've just entered now, we actually have done an analysis before. So you can see the bottom half of the screen, there's 2 graphs. One of them on the right-hand side refers to current values. The other one has a date stamp as of 2 days ago. So you can see that the history, the unique thing about risk management compared to something like finance is in finance you close off a period, it's closed and you start again. In risk management, it's a continually iterative process. So you have the opportunity to go into a risk and you can either leave it as it is and say that risk hasn't changed, or you can go and update it. The update is done on a continual basis, and therefore you're not having to go and reinvent the process every quarter or every 6 months. You've always got a live set of risks which you can then go and adjust. And SAP gives us the ability to go and assess this. So in the first step, it gives us our probability, and you can see here we've worked on a best practice 5 scale. And you can see we've used terminology such as rare, unlikely, possible, likely, and almost certain. Again, we've standardized on some best practice, but the naming of these 5 categories is flexible. So part of the RDS is that we can configure that for each customer. So on a probability basis, I'm going to say that this is actually a very likely risk. And if I click on my impact levels, what it does is it actually opens a sub-screen to this risk, and it says, here's the 3 impacts that you identified on the previous screen, the financial, operations, and stakeholder relations impact. And I can go through and I can say what is the impact of each of these. And I'm going to say that the first 2 are minor, but the third one is a major risk to us. And you can see what it's done is it's rolled that up to the impact where my cursor is now. The impact for the risk has taken the maximum value of the impacts. So the risk impact aggregates to the individual impacts aggregate to the risk impact using a maximum value. And the reason it does that is you might have 10 risks. And in there might be 10 low risks and 1 very high risk. If you took an average, you would be hiding and filtering down the fact that there's a high risk in there. So it takes the maximum value. But you could have 5 or 6 different impacts. Now, in SAP standard functionality, these different impact types you can actually analyze in different ways. So you might say that this is a financial impact, and therefore we're doing it using a quantitative methodology, whereas an operational impact we're using a very simple 5 scale. In the RDS, we standardized on it where we don't do that, but you could. And so once we've done that, we can then go and perform that analysis we've done it on an inherent risk, we can now go and perform that on a residual risk as well. And you can see to work out the risk score, it's essentially the probability times the impact equals a risk score. So in this case, on inherent risk, 4 times 4 is 16. And of course, the maximum value is 5 times 5 is 25. And if we take that back to our heat map, that means it'll be in the top right-hand quadrant in terms of red.
Yeah,
so
that's just a follow-on question to the earlier one in regards to the oversight. So who essentially would complete this particular analysis? Is it the internal audit folks, or is it someone within management who has, certain rights to particular risks that are pertinent to them only?
That's a good question, and I think it's very much based on the risk maturity of the organization. So we have organizations where internal audit are still responsible for risk management, although that's increasingly frowned upon now for reasons of independence. Normally, management are responsible for the risks in their organization because the controls that are in place should be the standard operating procedures in the business. Right? So if we have an objective and we have a risk of not achieving that objective, then a control should be a standard operating procedure as to how we go and make sure we're in line with our objective. So it's a management function. So increasingly, management are responsible for their risks. But sometimes in less mature organizations who do risk assessments, let's say once a year, they'll go into a workshop, all of the risks will be up in front of them, they'll go through an exercise of assessing them in the screen, the risk manager or the internal auditor will be responsible for updating it and putting it into a report, and that's done. So that's a question of risk maturity, but the goal is management are responsible for their own risks. And so once we've assessed our risk, the third part is to say, how are we going to respond to it? And I mentioned before that SAP used the word response. So there are a few different kinds of responses that can be in place. So if we actually go and click on the Assign button here, you can see that there's a couple of things that we can assign by way of responding to a risk. Now, the first thing at the bottom there is called a policy. So in risk management, we haven't used it in the RDS, but it's included in the software when you buy it, is full policy management functionality. And therefore, a policy is by its nature a preventative control. It's there to make sure that the risk doesn't materialize. So you can actually say, we're going to have a bunch of policies which are communicated using the policy management functionality of SAP Risk Management, and it's in there to help prevent a risk from materializing. In the main part, you would go and assign responses. So I'm going to go in this case we have 3 responses, and I'm just going to go into one and just to give a quick view on it, to say that the purpose of a response is to say, we have a name of a response. We're going to give it a description. So in this case, the response is that there's additional security, and it has a description to it. It belongs to the systems operation and planning division because that's where the risk was. But it doesn't have to. You could have a risk sitting in division, but the response or the control is actually a head office function. And so we can go and sign that, and we've actually assigned Kate Williams in this case as the person required to go and respond to it. And we can say, what's it for? Is it corrective by nature? Is it a preventative control? Or is it preventative and corrective by nature? And why are we doing this? Is it to transfer, terminate, tolerate, or treat? So you may be aware of the standard 4 T's. Are we transferring this in terms of, for example, ensuring the risk? Are we terminating it by saying that, in fact, it's just not worth it? This risk is too high. We're going to terminate the activity that causes this risk. We're going to tolerate it and say, hold on a second, there's nothing we can do about this, but there is a risk level, but we just have to accept it. Or we're going to treat it and put some other mitigation plans in place. In this case, I'm going to say we're going to tolerate it, and we can go in and give it a due date and say that that's due on the 28th of April of this year. And then on the right-hand side, we can also say how far we're doing, and we can go in and we can perform an effectiveness rating. And so in this particular methodology, the effectiveness rating doesn't go and affect the residual risk rating. It's really for reference purpose, and so that auditors can focus their audits as well. Clearly, a current effectiveness on a control that is very good is going to track the auditor's attention. So we can go in and we can perform a number of responses into there as well. And the final tab that's really relevant is that we can go in, and in this case you can see that the owner of this risk is Kate Williams, but I can actually go and assign one or more owners to this, because there are cases where other individuals might be responsible. So I'm now going to place Gregory. As you'll see on here, he's now responsible for this risk also. And so I can go through, I can now save that risk, and I'm done. And if I go back to my analysis, you can also see the latest ratings in that example.
Hey, Philip, a question for you, and I'm not sure. In regards to, is it possible to link a response to a particular control within the GRC process?
SAP has a slightly different terminology. So you can, one of the responses can be a response, so a management response. It can be a policy, as we've seen, but it can be a process control. So in the SAP process control module that some of you might have installed at the moment running your SOX or compliance environment, one of the controls that is in place to make your process efficient or compliant to a SOX requirement can be assigned in the risk management module as a control. Because the whole point is that a single control can affect both a process or a sub-process, make you compliant to your legislations or requirements or regulations, but can be mitigating a risk. And as you go into the policy management part, can also be put in place there to provide assurance that the policy is in place as well. So that's why SAP have called it a response, because it's not just a control. It could be a response, a policy, or a control. And in fact, in that is where GRC finally comes together. A single control can affect a risk, a sub-process, and that control could also be in place to mitigate your segregation of duty risks in the access control module of SAP GRC as well. So this is where the harmonization and the interlinking or integration of all the SAP modules within GRC really work. Now, I've shown you a bit about the software. If I talk a little bit about the RDS, because that's where a lot of the value is going to come in terms of this call. What we've done is we have pre-built and configured a set of scales and ranges based on best practice experience. And so on a probability level, we've worked on 1 to 5. On an impact level, we've worked on 1 to 5. And we've created 4 risk levels which have an associated set of colors. And that's so that we can effectively produce a heat map and we can prioritize our risks. So these are changeable, but in the RDS, we have standardized on these as well. And part of the reason we've standardized is so that you can materialize your risks. And I'm going to explain this for a moment. So it's what SAP calls impact thresholds. So you can see there's a couple of screens here which say risk thresholds at the top. On the left-hand side, this one is in South African Rand. On the left-hand side, I've got my division. And you can see the catastrophic lower level for division is 1 million. On the right-hand side, I've got my group, and it's 2 million. So if I had a risk which was 1.5 million, for example, on the left-hand side, that would be catastrophic for my division. But on the right-hand side for my group, 1 million actually fits in my moderate impact level. And this is how SAP does aggregation. It says from whose perspective do you want to see this risk impact? If you want to see it from the thresholds of the guy on the left, well, in our reporting, we'll make that catastrophic and we'll see it as a red risk. If you want to see it from the perspective of the group, which you normally would if you're looking from the board, we're going to say, well, that's a moderate risk, based on the fact that the group has a much larger materiality, right? Their turnover or their profitability is going to be significantly larger. So it gives this ability to do a report like the one that you're looking at and should appear on your screen in just a moment. And this is what we call a detailed roll-up of risks. By doing your normal risk assessment, but by entering threshold data into the organization, it's going to quantify this risk for you. So what you can see here is that the first risk is called lack of effective on-site security. And this risk has a total value at risk of $259 million. But that's as a group. It then breaks it down and says this risk appears in 6 of our divisions, and we can see each of those divisions, how it works out. Now, on the right-hand side, you can see it's a medium risk for the first 5, but it's actually a different quantitative value. So, for example, the holdings item risk is 210 million, but the development foundation is only 18 million. And that's because from a Powercom holdings perspective, that's from a group. Their turnover is so much larger that a medium risk is much more impactful than it would be for one of the smaller divisions like Powercom Development Foundation. So as long as when you buy the RDS, as long as you're able to put in some impact thresholds, which is normally based on turnover or contribution, it'll automatically calculate this for you. So that's fundamentally where aggregation comes in, which so many software tools have fallen down, and where Excel simply can't fall into play. Now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the RDS itself, because I know I'm running out of time here. And the RDS is essentially out of the box. And there's a number of things we've put in place to assist in making it a 4-week implementation. The first thing is some organizations aren't particularly risk mature. They don't even have a beginning. So we have built the Enterprise Risk Management Framework. In other words, that's the business document that the board uses to manage its risk in terms of who's responsible for risks, what's the terminology we're going to use, and so on. So, and we've done that based on both COSO and on ISO 31000 risk frameworks. We've pre-configured the levels and ranges, so the impact and probability and risk levels, as I showed you before. We've pre-configured reports, as shown earlier, the registers, heat maps, critical risk reports, and so on. Again, you can always build more reports, but we've predefined a minimum number. Because this is SAP and there's normal standard project management methodologies, when we do enterprise implementations, we've done it using the ASAP SAP methodology. So we've predefined the blueprint and the RICEF registers, which, if you're not familiar, a RICEF register is any variation from the standard SAP. So even a report, for example, is a variation from standard SAP. So we have to fill in RICEF registers. and your project team would normally make us do that, and that's what you enter into Solution Manager as well. So all that's predefined, and so is the training. So classroom training is all part of that. And the price of doing an RDS, clearly it's based on an organizational scale. But for most organizations to get up and running, we're talking about a very small 1-month implementation, which excluding the software is going to be at about $120,000 US, including the implementation, all of the reporting, the documentation, and the training, and that should be live within a month. The only thing that would vary that is if we're rolling this out to thousands of users, or if there's going to be a significant number of extra reports, as an example. But at the end of this call, you'll see Troy's details, and you're very welcome to contact him, and he'll be able to give you details and get quotes to you if you need more details in that regard as well. So in terms of wrapping up the call, I think this is very much a call to action. So risk management is probably the least understood module of all SAP's GRC's individual modules. But in fact, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Risk management is a governance process which is independent of industry. Now, there are some specific items like credit risk management, which are unique to banks, which clearly this isn't designed to provide a solution to. So there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Everything we've done is based on standard business practices, and we've implemented a number of these solutions in this regard. Commercially, it's out of the box. So it's very, very quick to be able to implement. We are just completing the SAP certification process at the moment, but that's really a formality because there's no variations from standard SAP. And it should be 100% complete within 4 weeks. And to give you ideas, we've done that in the remotest parts of deep, dark Africa within that period as well, where connectivity has been huge issue. So there's no reason that Turnkey shouldn't be able to do that in a more developed environment. And so that lends me to finally just providing Troy's details, and I'm going to hand over back to Troy just to finally wrap up. And of course, we're going to open the floor to any questions you've got.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I just wanted to basically state, we've added my contact information here. So if you do have any questions about SAP risk management that don't get answered as part of this webinar, please feel free to reach out to me, or if you're interested in getting additional information about our rapid deployment solution for implementing risk management, definitely feel free to use this contact information to get a hold of me. Carlos?
Fantastic, Troy. Thank you both to you, Troy and Philip, for a really great and thorough demonstration on SAP's risk management tool and how you guys can obviously deliver the rapid deployment solution. We did have one last question here, and we'll hopefully give the audience members a few minutes back from their day today. But can the tool include other variables such as velocity or the speed and trend, so if it's moving up, down, or staying flat?
Sure. So that's actually two questions in one. So the first thing is in SAP, as part of the methodologies or the analysis profiles, there is an option to turn on what's called speed of onset. Speed of onset is essentially risk velocity. How quickly is this risk going to materialize? And that can be part of your calculation. We have found that it's used in less than 5% of cases, which is why we didn't build it into the RDS, but absolutely it can be. The second part is the trend analysis, and that's really a report. So on the analysis screen, you'll be able to look at all of the historic data, but in a report, we've also built some trend reports where you might go back in the 3 or 4 previous periods and look whether it's gone up or down and stay the same. And if you have a look at one of my reports as we go through, you'll see that there's some colored arrows which will automatically color the report based on how many or based on whether it's gone up or down. So again, trend reporting is a standard part of the functionality. It's a question of how the customer would want to represent it in a report.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip. And just we do have a couple more minutes. So I definitely want to give the audience a chance to utilize their questions box within the GoToWebinar panel. And ask any other questions before we do go ahead and wrap this up. I know I'd love to give everyone a few minutes back of their day, but this is definitely a great opportunity for anyone to ask questions of Philip and of Troy. So I do have one other question that just came through here, Philip. Could the software be applied to SOC1 and SOC2 compliance?
So in terms of the compliance, it depends on the view that you take. So some organizations take a risk-based view, and in the risk universe, they actually structure it. Instead of risk data, they put their compliance and requirements data, so the requirement is managed as a risk. And therefore, it's rated as a risk to the organization, which it is, and it is also, there are mitigations which are put in place. And those mitigations would be in place clearly to align with compliance. I would stress, however, so that's a risk-based approach to compliance, and we tend to find financial institutions especially do that. But process control is specifically designed to align your processes with regulatory requirements, and that you then have controls in place to automatically monitor your environments to make sure you're compliant to those requirements and regulations. So there's really a couple of different approaches to how you do it, but it certainly can be done.
Great, thanks, Philip. And then a couple other questions here. Just we do have some time here left. Does it fit the ISO better or the other standard, COSO?
So in terms of SAP Standard Design, it's probably closer aligned to COSO than ISO 31000. ISO, by comparison, is actually based on the Australian-New Zealand standards, and I think COSO is much more entrenched in the North American market, which is a bigger market for SAP. So I think on a commercial basis, they've aligned it closer to where their customers and their dollars would be. But both are fully enabled in the solution, and we've got an RDS which is ISO 31000, and we've got an RDS which is COSO based, and there's no difference in cost or implementation time. It's really just based on how you as a customer would manage risk.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip. I appreciate that. And now the risk management tool, is that also within the SAP Enterprise, or is that something separate and something you guys can talk to folks separately outside of the webinar?
So look, certainly we'd be very happy to have those chats. I mean, fundamentally, so the risk management module is part of the SAP GRC holistic module. SAP GRC has 3 solutions: risk management, process control, and access control, and they are licensed individually. So you would have to, just because you have GRC access control, which is the most prevalent of the 3, doesn't mean you'd be licensed to risk management. Although there are a number of customers out there who have risk management, either they bought it or it's kind of been freeware / shelfware from SAP, and now they're looking to make sure that they get value out of this software that they've got sitting there. But it's not part of the standard enterprise solution from SAP.
Fantastic. So with that, and actually we still have a couple more questions coming in, so I will take us up to about another couple minutes here, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up this webinar. Is the testing for compliance or effectiveness linked to the risk tool itself?
So there's 2 kinds of testing. So if you're doing process control, automated testing, so doing control testing in process control, you can use that control as a response to a risk. And yes, you can make it so that the results of that can affect your risks. So in other words, using automated testing, you're varying your risk levels. So that's very, very detailed risk management, and it can absolutely be done. Principally, where most customers are going wrong, or where their maturity level is, just identifying risks, talking about them and understanding them, and understanding who's responsible for what, is so far advanced compared to where a lot of companies are right now that that's the first step. So our first slide was Excel to SAP in a month, because most customers are using Excel. But certainly if you're using process control and you're using controls from that, absolutely they can be used as mitigations in the risk management module.
Fantastic. So we are actually going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Gentlemen, I really appreciate your time today and really giving our audience a chance to better understand how they can make this GRC solution, not outside of just having an effective tool, but having it up and running in a very quick time frame. So Just a couple of last-minute housekeeping items before we end the webinar today. I just want to remind the audience that you will be prompted to take a short survey once we do conclude today, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. And we ask that you join us on Proformative.com to continuously deliver the content and help us engage our audience, and we'll definitely leverage the speakers to join us in continuing this discussion around GRC. We also, during your time in the short survey, you will have the option to make a connection and request an introduction to the two speakers, both Troy and Philip, as well as to SAP, and we'll be more than happy to facilitate that. And I do want to conclude with thanking both Troy and Philip for their time today, and SAP as well for being such a generous sponsor and giving us the opportunity to bring you this great content that we share today during the webinar for free. And I will now close down the webinar, and you'll be prompted to take the short survey. And we greatly appreciate your feedback. We look forward to seeing you again at another Proformative event or online at proformative.com. Have a great rest of the day, folks. Thank you and take care.